Both in my role as paranormal investigator and incidents that have happened to me in my own personal life, I can vouch for the fact that ghosts are a very real phenomena. But not all of them are spirits of the deceased. There are other types of apparition and phenomena. Also, how do ghosts come about in the first place? Those questions and others on the subject we will be answering for you here on episode 3. I'm Adrian J. Andrews, and this is Dead But Not Forgotten. On the horizon is Brighton in East Sussex, the second most haunted city in the country. Before you ask, the first is York. It's an appropriate place to start this episode. So what causes a ghost? Well, if you're talking about the interactive kind, the answer is sudden death. Some people don't even realise they're dead and carry on their daily business. Some are afraid to cross over because they've lived a rather dubious life and they don't know what to expect is waiting for them on the other side. Some people refuse to go over because of unfinished business, and others simply don't know what to do. A theory was given to me the year before last. Between conception and birth, a baby has 9 months to prepare itself for the life ahead. Much is the same with a terminally ill patient. But if a life is suddenly cut short, there is no preparation time. The person with a scientific background frequently says to me is that, what are ghosts? What are they made of? No one's ever analysed it. Well, much the same could be said of flames. There's nothing, they're not vegetable, mineral or animal. You can't get a piece of a flame and analyse it in a laboratory. What are ghosts? This isn't as straightforward a question as it would seem, as there are many different levels to consider. Many mediums will tell you that they're made up of ectoplasm, but nobody has ever been able to capture any for scientific analysis. Charlatans during the Victorian era would use fabrics such as cheesecloth to fake ectoplasm as if a spirit was just about to manifest. Nowadays, in the age of digital photography, orbs seem to have stolen the limelight away from ectoplasm. Personally, I'm very dubious about so-called orb photography. 9 times out of 10 they turn out to be dust particles, pollen grains, or even insects. Again, with the advent of digital technology, ghost photographs nowadays are all too easily faked. There are very few I consider genuine, and indeed, when you go out deliberately to photograph a ghost, remember, they don't perform to order. But my favourites by far are those that have left experts stumped for an explanation for many years. This is the Brown Lady. The image was captured in 1936 by Captain Provand and Indra Shearer at Rainham Hall in Norfolk for Country Life magazine. The apparition is thought to be that of Lady Dorothy Townsend. The Reverend Hardy and his wife were on holiday in London in 1966. Having heard so much about the Tulip Staircase in the Queen's House at National Maritime Museum, they wanted to see it for themselves, and whilst there, the Reverend took a photograph. On returning to their native Canada, they had their holiday snaps developed, only to discover this mysterious, shrouded figure that wasn't visible during their visit. This has since become one of the most famous ghost pictures in history. But there are other kinds of ghost. The most reported ghost is that of a living person. Oh yes, it can happen. It's called a crisis apparition. Let's take a look. It may seem incredible, but you don't have to die to become a ghost. Indeed, the most reported sightings are those of people still alive. Crisis apparitions occur when someone is critically ill or badly injured in, for example, a road traffic accident. The injured or sick person may be thinking of a particular person or place, and their apparition can be witnessed by that person or in that location. Crisis apparitions can also occur immediately before death as a final bid to tell loved ones that they're approaching their end. It was my mother who told me the first story I'd ever heard about crisis apparitions, but she didn't know the technical term for them. She called them visions. It was when she was a little girl. She came from a family of 7, and she actually shared a bed with 3 of her sisters. One night, she woke up with the head and shoulders of a man she knew as Mr. Sparks, who owned a junkyard not far from their home. She sat bolt upright and nudged the sister that was closest to her. Her sister knew something wasn't right, so she hid her head under the covers. She smiled at Mr. Sparks, and he smiled back and then faded into nothing. The following morning she told her own mother, my grandmother, what had happened. Her sisters tried to shut the whole thing out by covering their ears and humming very loudly. But my grandmother was taken aback. "You saw Mr. Sparks in your bedroom at the foot of your bed? What sort of time was this?" My mother told her what her estimate of the time was. "Well, that's weird," she said, "because around that time Mr. Sparks passed away last night. He died." In August 2013, I met a young man who had actually been the victim of a crisis apparition. He told me that there was a period not long ago when he was critically ill. Now, going out clubbing on a Saturday night was like a religious experience to him. It was something he wouldn't dare miss for all the tea in China, but his illness did keep him in bed. And yet, when he was well enough to venture out again and met up with his mates, several of them told him that he couldn't have been ill because they'd had a conversation with him that week in the nightclub. He didn't know what had happened. They'd had a full conversation. It couldn't be a case of mistaken identity. When he told me, I was able to explain to him that what they actually saw, and despite the fact he had no memory of it, was his own crisis apparition. You'll recall earlier that I hinted that there were other ghosts other than the interactive type. The non-interactive type are known as residual energy, also known as the stone tape theory. The theory being that a building such as this behind me, the fabric of it records traumatic experiences of its past and can play them back occasionally, sometimes on the anniversary of that happening if there is a death involved. They're also known as anniversary ghosts. But all you can do is watch them. They repeat over and over and over again. They're not interactive. They are literally recordings. Talking about ghosts and apparitions, it would be wrong if we left out poltergeists. The word poltergeist is German for noisy ghost, and indeed in some instances they really can be noisy. It's a phenomena where solid objects are usually levitated or moved about, and indeed many hauntings do include such activities. Poltergeists can act of their own volition, but in many cases the centre of the activity is a young person on the threshold of adulthood, and funnily enough, normally female. There was a famous case that happened in the 1970s, the Enfield Poltergeist. Here's the story. It could have been a scene from the film The Exorcist. Cold breezes, objects flying through the air, strange graffiti appearing on the walls, pools of water appearing from nowhere, boxes of matches bursting into flames, physical assaults, and voices from beyond the grave emanating from an 11-year-old girl. All this happened for the period of a year behind the closed doors of an ordinary council house in Enfield, North London, number 284 Green Street. When the experts and even the police were brought in to investigate, no explanation other than the paranormal could be found. It all began in 1977. Peggy Hodgson, having split with her husband, was left to bring up her 4 children single-handedly. There was Margaret, 12, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7. On the 30th of August, Peggy was trying to get the children to bed when she heard Janet upstairs complaining that her brother's beds were wobbling and shaking. Of course, Mrs. Hodgson put it all down to a prank. However, the following evening there was an almighty crash from upstairs, and on going to investigate in her daughter's room, witnessed a chest of drawers moving of its own accord. From that point on, the family got little sleep, as there were continuous noises in the house. Knocking on the floor, the walls and the ceilings became very frightening indeed. The police were called in and were completely mystified by the disturbances. WPC Caroline Heaps actually witnessed a chair move on its own. Eventually the police left, explaining to Peggy that it wasn't a matter for them. In desperation, Peggy called the Daily Mirror, who sent a photographer, Graham Morris, who described what he witnessed as chaos. He managed to capture the events in these photographs. The BBC went in and experienced failure and destruction of their recording equipment, so the Society for Psychical Research was contacted. All was quiet just after they arrived, but soon Lego bricks and t-shirts were flying about, followed by marbles that were found to be hot to the touch. Sofas rose into the air, furniture was flung about, and the family were thrown out of their beds. And throughout all of this, the knocking persisted. 11-year-old Janet then began speaking in a gruff, gravelly voice that identified itself as Bill Wilkins, who had described his death in an armchair within the house several years prior. "Just before I died, I went blind, and then I had an hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in the chair in the corner downstairs." Much of the activity centred on 11-year-old Janet, who would often enter a violent trance state. On one occasion when she did this, an iron fireplace in her bedroom was wrenched out of the wall. Years later, Janet, who now lives in Essex with her husband, admitted that she and her siblings used to fake some of the stuff to put the SPR specialists to the test. They were always caught out. She admitted that only 2% of the activities in Green Street were faked. Eventually the Hodgsons moved out, and the current occupants of 284 Green Street don't wish to be identified. They have children, and they don't want to scare them, although it has been said that there is still a tangible atmosphere within the house. A particularly disturbing poltergeist case in San Pedro, California in the late spring of 1989. Jackie was in the process of a particularly sticky divorce from her husband and moved into a small bungalow that she rented on her own. Within 2 months of her moving in, she was complaining that the interior of the place smelt of stale urine. Something was oozing out of the cupboards and the walls, and there were continuous bangs and thumps coming from the attic. Distraught, and with no previous interest in anything paranormal, she brought in some investigators. The violence escalated when one of the investigators climbed into the attic to take some pictures and had his camera destroyed. When the substance oozing from the cupboards and walls was sent off for laboratory testing, it was found to be human blood plasma. The investigators brought in a professional videographer, Barry Conrad, who himself climbed into the attic to take some footage. But his colleagues heard some very distressing noises from down below, and when they climbed into the attic to investigate, found that Conrad had a noose around his neck and had been lifted onto a nail from one of the high rafters, something he could not possibly have done of his own volition. One of his colleagues had literally to bend the nail in order to free him. Conrad has actually been filmed exiting the attic doorway with the noose still around his neck. Jackie eventually moved out of the bungalow and into her own apartment, but she stayed in touch with Conrad. She fancied him like crazy, and eventually they started an affair. But he was taking advantage of her, and she became angry, and then the attacks transferred themselves to Conrad's apartment. On a number of occasions he was attacked by blades. At one point, sleeping quietly in his bed, scissors flew at him and impaled his pillow. It has not been totally discounted that a type of psychokinesis can be involved, where Jackie is the cause of all the trouble. For the time being it remains a mystery, but the owner of the bungalow, despite the fact there is still activity there, doesn't want its identity disclosed. He rents it out and is afraid of losing his income. After the last episode I got an inquiry. Somebody asked me, I shot some of the footage in episode 2 in a cemetery when it was getting dark, much like it is now. Are you not afraid? Well, the simple answer is no. I'm a paranormal investigator, so I can take most things, although I can scream like a girl if something suddenly goes bang. It is a known fact, however, that many cemeteries do not have ghosts. Whatever horrors have happened to the people before they come here, happened before they came here. Now, generally, they're at rest. The haunted cemeteries, however, are normally those that had a guardian who was sacrificed for the sake of looking after the deceased. Someone who gave up their own life suddenly and still hangs about. And they're not common, but there are a few cemeteries that are about. And if this is one of them, I'm really not at all afraid. Generally, spirit come with love and kindness. From childhood into adulthood, we have all been thrilled by stories designed to scare us. From our earliest experiences of being read stories by the Grimm brothers, to renting out the latest horror film on a Friday night. Classic images of haunted houses have been engraved on our psyche. But the reality is slightly different. Not all locations that are allegedly haunted fit the stereotypical image. Some buildings are quite modern and clinical in appearance, and have actually inherited paranormal activity from whatever was on that land before them. So what constitutes a haunting? People may report encountering apparitions in certain places, but although regularly seen, this alone does not mean that the location is actually haunted. It may just be a case of residual energies or stone tape recordings that we have covered before. If you're a fan of television ghost hunting shows, you'll have often heard two terms in particular on a regular basis: invisitation and grounded. Invisitation refers to a soul or spirit which has crossed over to the other side but chooses to visit a location from time to time out of love or concern. they're not a phenomena that is based at that place permanently. Grounded, on the other hand, is what we actually refer to as a haunting. This is a spirit or a soul who has become stuck at that location, for whom, for one reason or another, crossing to the world of spirit has proved impossible. They have become a permanent feature of their surroundings. Despite what many ghost and horror stories would have us believe, ghosts don't usually harm the living, but that's not to say they are incapable of doing so. In my experience, if they were a particularly nasty piece of work in life, if they haven't crossed over, they normally maintained that attitude. I have come across incidents of ghosts punching people, inflicting painful scratches, poking people, and even throwing hard objects. But this takes a lot of energy to carry out. Energy they alone do not possess. Therefore, they will use the energy from battery-operated equipment, such as cameras, or electrical equipment, such as televisions, or if nothing like that is available, human energy. This is why on some ghost hunting shows you'll occasionally hear one of the team claiming to feel drained or sick. In general, spirits mean no harm, but some are even afraid of us. To spirit, our aura or bubble of energy around us looks bright. But in the case of psychics and mediums, they look even brighter. This is why some spirits who recognize the different auras are drawn to mediums. But there is another type of entity that paranormal investigators are very wary of. Spirit from the lower realms. These are spirits who have never lived a life on our plane. They usually show themselves as black shadows or mists, sometimes with glowing red eyes, and seem to be able to adopt any shape, including animals. Devil dogs, yes, they do exist, are almost certainly this type of phenomena. Referred to as demons in some circles, these entities are best avoided if encountered. Their occurrences are relatively rare, but they can be brought into our environment by badly conducted seances and Ouija board sessions. Well, in the light of this fading day, it's about time I brought this episode to an end, and I wish to thank you for watching and staying with me. Next time, in episode 4, we'll be looking at ghosts again, but a different angle this time. Ghost hunting and television. How come all these television shows have so much activity when the reality is that ghost hunting can be a very dead sort of business? I'll see you next time. This has been Dead But Not Forgotten, and I'm Adrian J. Andrews. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Both in my role as paranormal investigator and as around a young person coming into the adult. On the horizon, through the mists, is Brighton in Sussex, the second most haunted country, child of adulthood, and again, normally females. But not all of them are spirits of the deceased. These questions and more we'll be looking at in depth in our very third at in our third episode.